Okay, I think that's everyone from the waiting room. We might have a few more, but we'll go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is our fourth Wednesday. The fourth Wednesday of every month is going to be dedicated to understanding culture. And we are focusing on taking a deeper dive and understanding into Afghanistan culture. So the information here today is going to be shared by an individual affiliated with Bethany Christian. She is unable to be here in this moment, so she did the hard work of putting together a presentation and recording it. So we'll be going through the recording. And before we do that, again, just a few housekeeping items. If you are here for the Lunch and Learn series, we would really love if you are able to sign in, and you can do that one of two ways. You can access the link that's in the chat box, or you are welcome to use the QR code and access it through the camera on your phone. And this is just a way for us to see who's showing up in these spaces, kind of track organizations that are joining us. So I'd appreciate if you take a moment to sign in. We also are going to then move through this time of the recording regarding Afghan culture from Freshta. And because she isn't able to be here and be present with us, the hope is that if there are any questions or thoughts that come up, if you could just do me a favor as we're going through this, if you can type them into the chat box, that will keep a record of everything, which then I can share with her and pass along to her after today's presentation. The recording is about 35 minutes, so it won't take our entire time. Once it gets going, we'll just listen to it again, throw any questions or comments or connections you're making in the chat box. And then once it's done, I'll kind of bring us back together and we'll transition from there. Two more housekeeping items. This series is going to start repeating next week. So next week, Wednesday, we start with the first Wednesday series, which will be Refugee 101, and that will be facilitated by Jessica. And so that's going to start again next week. So if you're just finding out about this or you've just received information, yes, there are recordings. We're trying really hard to get them on our website. There's a lot of moving pieces that we are navigating. So I appreciate patience with that. But if you don't want to wait for the recordings to land on the website, you can also show up next week, Wednesday, and we'll go through the Refugee 101 topic that will be facilitated by Jessica. Let's see. I think the other housekeeping item that I would like to offer is, because this is a video, what I have noticed, and hopefully this goes well, but what I have noticed is that it might play a little bit better if when it starts, everyone's video is off themselves. And so the only video feed is the video feed of the recorded presentation on Afghan culture. Any questions or comments or thoughts before we dive in? Okay, fabulous. I'm going to keep my eye on the chat. If something comes up, let me know. Otherwise, what we will do is get started on this. Now, hopefully I can kick this off okay. I need to pause this. Okay. Can you see let's see. Are you able to see the Vimeo presentation okay? Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. All right. So again, this was a presentation gifted to us by Faresha from Bethany Christian. She went and put this together. It is recorded. So I'm going to hit play, turn my video off. If anything comes up, please throw it in the chat. Otherwise, in the meantime, questions, comments, connections, thoughts, put in the chat, and then that way we can be sure to pass them along. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you can't hear sound, let me know. And
Hi there, my name is Caitlin Jackson, and I am the Afghan Site Supervisor at Bethany Christian Services. Thank you so much for joining this recorded presentation of Afghan culture. I am super excited to have here with me Faresha Torajan, who just recently joined our staff here at Bethany to help us respond to the Afghan arrivals coming to West Michigan. She arrived to the US in 2016 from Afghanistan. She was living in Kabul before she came here. So she has really great insight to share with us today as we consider what it looks like to welcome the Afghan arrivals well. All right, Faresha. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm so honored to be here today and just kind of share a piece of my culture and my insight on this presentation today. So let's just get started. So before we start and go too deep into presentation, there are some misconceptions that I thought would be kind of good to talk about and get out of the way. So we will just start out with them. So these are things that I will mention, and if these apply to you, you can either put a mark or just kind of count them off on your fingers, and then we will talk about them later. So the first is Afghanistan is in the Middle East. Afghanistan's national language is Arabic. Afghanistan is a desert with camels roaming around. Afghanistan is an all-extremist Muslim country, and Afghanistan is the birthplace of terrorism. So now we will kind of reveal the answers and kind of what the corrections to those misconceptions are. So a lot of people say Afghanistan is in the Middle East. So this was a term that was invented by the British in the 1800s. And the Middle East is actually West Asia. And Afghanistan is in Central Asia. And we have a term in all of our history books that refers to Afghanistan as Qalb-e Asiya, which means the heart of Asia. And Afghanistan has two national languages, and because we are so we're a multi-ethnic country, we do have many other languages, but we did choose the two Dari and Pashto to be the national languages. And we do get all 4 seasons, and we are familiar with snow. And unfortunately, and a big misconception is that Afghanistan is only Muslim, but it does include other religions as well, and we will get into that further in the presentation. And Afghanistan is not the birthplace of terrorism, but in fact, a lot of the conflicts in the country are foreign-sponsored terrorism. So just a quick history of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has served as a center of trade networks for many centuries. It's placed in Central Asia, which if you have looked into a lot of the past histories of all powerful empires, that's one place that they would always maintain their trade routes through and to kind of maintain your economic influence. And so Afghanistan has also been referred to as the graveyard of empires, and there's many reasons for that, but for today we will kind of cover 2 of the main empires that had major influence in the country, and this includes Persian and Mongol. And Persian influence in the country is, pretty significant. For example, Dari, one of the national languages, is driven from Persian, which is also known as Farsi. And Persian influence also has impacted a lot of different poetry and artifacts in the country, and different types of music and dances that we have in the country. And more specifically, Persian influence is heavily seen in Herat, which you can see on the map is kind of on the western side of Afghanistan. And Mongol influence in the country. So we actually have an ethnic group that's known to be a direct descendant of the Mongols that when they invaded Afghanistan. And they were mainly very involved in central Afghanistan, which today is called the Hazarajat. And there you will see a lot of Mongol artifacts and historical sites like the Buddhas. And next I'll talk about the foreign sponsored conflict. So obviously there's many other powerful countries that were involved in the conflicts in Afghanistan, but for today's purposes, I've named two of them, the Soviet Union and the British. And the British, like I said earlier, they had a heavy influence, especially with trade and economics in the country. And also the Soviet Union, which, they're kind of close to the location of Afghanistan. And because of that geographical and national interest, there was a lot of proxy wars and kind of using Afghanistan as a playground to carry out these wars. And now for the demographics, like I said earlier, we are a very multi-ethnic nation. We have many different ethnic groups, and we have over 12 different ethnic groups, and we will go into them further. And there's this notion of ethnicism that has caused civil war and civil tensions between different ethnic factions in the country. And we will also cover those further in the presentations. And Afghanistan is also multilingual. We have over 22 different languages, and a lot of them are dialects. So for example, we have Dari, and then from Dari for the Hazara ethnic group, they speak Hazaragi. So it's very similar to Dari, but they also have their own kind of specific vocabulary that they use and different grammars and such. And so Dari versus Farsi, a lot of people usually get them mixed up and they assume that they're the same thing. So for the most part, they are very similar. There's about a 3% difference in vocabulary. And then there's also the biggest differentiation is determined by the heavy accent. So for example, in Dari, you would refer to a banana as kela, but in Farsi, you would say muz. And in Dari, you would refer to skin as post, but in Farsi, it would be pust. And so there's also, like Dari, there's also other Pashto and Urdu dialects that came with as more groups migrated into the country. And so in this picture here, you will see kind of the different percentages of the different populations in Afghanistan. And even this is actually kind of outdated. This is from 2017. And so with the recent events, there has been a slight change in the different percentages. And that might be something that will probably show up in the next couple of years. And so this slide kind of shows the ethnic groups that are mostly heard of and talked about in the news and in a lot of different orientations. And so there's the Hazara, Tajik, Pashtun, Baluch, Uzbek, and Turkmen, and so they share a common national culture, but then within those ethnic groups, they have their own specific cultures and traditions that we practice. And so there is an ethnic group that has received a lot of persecution, unfortunately. And in fact, they have had a Hazara genocide. And Hazaras were once the majority of the total population of the nation. But unfortunately, with the Pashtun dynasty, specifically under Amir Abdurrahman Khan, he brought a lot of oppressive policies and regimes specifically targeting Hazara population. And most of this persecution was simply due to the Hazara Shia religious faith, their ethnic origins, and economic and political roots. And when he came into power, more than half of Hazaras were massacred. And today we can still see, the effects. And this is one of the reasons that there's so much tension between a lot of the different ethnic groups and Hazaras. And, even today, Hazaras are driven out of their lands, and some Hazara children are still sold as slaves, and they lack a lot of access to essential services that are usually available to the majority of the population. So now to the fun stuff, the Afghan culture. So Afghanistan is a very collective society. In fact, when we are even talking about ourselves and our, something, even like when it comes to like individual doings, we still say we, refer to as we. And so sometimes people are like, who's we? So I always say, we is me. And so Afghanistan, like the US, has our own national anthem that we refer to as the Surud-e-Milli. Surud means anthem and Milli means national. And we have it both in Dari and in Pashto. And so we have the national address that's for women called Gand, and for men it's called the Piran Tumban. And as you can see in the picture on the top right corner, that is the national dress for the entire country. And then in every different tribe and ethnic group in the country has their own specific dress that they use. And so top left corner is the dress for Hazaras, and then bottom down is we do have a big influence from India. And so our ethnic counterparts that come from, that background and culture, we share a lot of different dress codes. And so that's one of them down there that we called as Punjabi. And then bottom right corner is also what's worn by a lot of our Tajik neighbors in the country as well. And so Afghanistan is a very music and festive filled country. And so there's this notion of forced hospitality. We want to make sure that everyone that we interact with that comes into our house is very comfortable, that they have enough to eat, that they have everything that they need taken care of. And so, one of the biggest part of the culture is that when you enter an Afghan house, they'll force you to eat, force you to drink a lot of tea. And we also have our own tribal music. So there's kind of like a national country type of music that we all use and listen to. And then every ethnic group and tribe has their own music that they create and listen to. And so we do have a national dance that's called the Atan. And with this dance, everyone stands in a circle and you usually have long hair and just kind of like do a lot of spins with your hair and just in a circle. And there's a lot of drums called tablas that are played. So it's definitely a fun, collective part of the tradition. And there's this tradition of kite flying that you will see all summer long and all spring long. And this was one of my personal favorite memories with my brothers. Usually you'll see a lot of boys doing this on the rooftops, and you have kite fights where you try to, cut off the string of somebody else's kite, and then you try to run after it and you collect as many kites as you can. And they even have like monthly or seasonal kite competitions. And so with sports, we do love sports, and our kind of national sports that's becoming football, or what a lot of people call soccer. And we're also very involved in martial arts. And I don't know how familiar you have been with keeping up with Afghan sports, but that's one area, martial arts, that we have been winning a lot of national competitions and international competitions in. So obviously with, like any other country, there's a lot of different holidays. And so with the different ethnic groups, there are, we have our kind of like national holidays that we celebrate. And then within every ethnic group, they also have their own traditions and holidays that they celebrate. So Nowruz, it literally translated means now is new, and Roz means day, so new day. And it's always celebrated in the spring, March 21st. And then there are two different Eids. Eid al-Fitr, that's celebrated after the last day of Ramadan or Ramadan. And then there's also Eid al-Adha that's celebrated on the 10th day of the 12th month of the Islamic calendar. And then there's Ashura that's usually celebrated by the Shia community. And so all of these fall on different dates of every year. And if this is something you're interested in, celebrating or wanting to know more about when you interact with your Afghan neighbors, you can always use an app that you can find online, and you can always, simply Google it. And so it'll always show you what day they fall on and what year. And so the last one is our Independence Day, August 19th. This is to commemorate our independence from the British. And this is kind of a conflict that a lot of Afghans might show, just because we don't know which independence we're celebrating from, which empire that took over. So now we'll talk about the food. So we have what you may have seen in a lot of pictures or families. We eat on the ground on this semi-tablecloth that's called dastarkhan. And you kind of sit around on tuashaks that are like little mattresses, and we eat sometimes with our hands, sometimes with spoons. It really, differs and depends on the family's preference. And usually we eat a lot of halal, which means clean foods. And a lot of our diet includes rice, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, a lot of plant-based, just because we grow them mostly ourselves in our own backyards, and then meat. And one thing that our culture is definitely famous for is naan and tea. So in the pictures on the right, you will see the picture on the bottom left corner is what we call as like the regular naan, which is for daily use. The one on the top right corner is called naan parparaki. That's the one you will see used mostly at weddings or just a lot of different holidays that we celebrated when we have a big mihmani or a big gathering and a big party. And the one on the bottom right corner is called naan mazari. That's very specific to the province of Mazar, and you usually don't find it in other provinces. And so Mazar is known for its own type of naan. And so we try to stay away from haram or defiled foods. And this includes, no pork byproducts, alcohol, or other uncleanly processed animals. And this applies to, most Afghans. And I have Afghan Muslim friends who, don't abide by that, and they do actually intake those foods. And there are certain seafoods that we do avoid, and that really depends on the family's preference. And so religion in Afghanistan is usually known, and that there's Shia and Sunni sects in Afghanistan, but there are also other sects of Islam like Smaila in the country, but because they're so minor, there's hardly studies and really hardly talked about. And there's other religions in the country as well, like there's Sikh, Hindu, Christianity, Baha'i, etc. And usually there's a big ethnic association with the different Muslim sects, like with Shias, that includes a lot of, Hazaras, and with Sunnis, that's Uzbeks, Pashtuns, Tajiks, and so it goes on from there. And so these are just some of the mannerisms that we usually practice. That would be that we would also like to share with you. And so with Afghan greetings, you will see that we, sometimes we do a handshake, but usually it's a hug and a few kisses on the cheeks as we talk and ask about how our families are doing, how our hands are doing, how your feet are doing, how your grandmother is doing, and on and on. And so left hand versus right hand. A lot of Afghans, we try to use our right hand, and that's what we promote, just because there are some ideologies and kind of some religious affiliated beliefs that the left hand is used for kind of like defiled or the haram things. And so I remember, like, even when I was in school, my teacher beat me up because I was left-handed, and she had me transferred to my right hand. And so, and another notion is because the left hand is used when you are getting ready to do namaz, you usually use your left hand to, for cleanliness in the bathroom prior to getting ready for namaz. And so there's also like this Afghan head bow where if we're thanking you or meeting you, or if we're saying bye, usually you'll see us do something like this. And so the handshake between male and female, and this is something that's really also dependent on the family preference. Usually it goes with like different social classes and different education levels of the family. And like, for example, you know, sometimes in the family dynamics, you'll see like if a man, the head of the family who's a man, if he usually does a handshake and introduces you to, you know, their spouse, then that's usually okay. You'll kind of see this initiated by the different family members, and then you can just kind of assume and tell by their body language if you are, if it is okay to shake the male or the female's hand. And then there's also the this big sign of respect when you meet an elderly, or just really someone older than you. They don't even have to be elderly, or someone that you highly respect in the family. You greet them by kissing their hand a few times sometimes, and holding their hand. And then there's also this big Afghan gesture that a lot of my expat friends who would come to the country would always leave and just going with the Afghan gesture. And it's really just like this, you know, hand toss that you do, whether you're mad, whether you're talking, whether you're dancing or joyful. And so that's something that you might see some Afghans doing, like, no. So here's some interaction tips when you do interact with your Afghan friends. One thing that that's kind of applies to really any culture that you're being introduced to: don't make assumptions, but rather be thoughtful in what kind of questions you ask and how you interact with them. And I guess that a big one is like the female and male interaction. And this is, again, initiated by the different members. You know, it also is different based on social class, different family members, and just individual preferences. And home visits, and usually it's kind of like an unspoken rule that you take off your shoes when you enter an Afghan household, but there are few Afghan individuals who, you know, don't mind that. And so if you don't know, and if you usually ask, like, should I take my shoes off? You know, a lot of us will say, no, just walk right in, please have a seat. But if you are struggling with it and you don't know, it's your best bet is to just take your shoes off. And just, if you're not a tea person, it's going to be kind of difficult when you enter an Afghan household. That's kind of also like a big sign of respect to our culture, that you should at least take a few sips of your tea. And that's something, if you're not a tea drinker, that you might want to start kind of getting open to, just because even when you have your Afghan clients, they will always treat you as guests, even though you may be their caseworker or just someone that's assisting them in different programs. And then floor versus table, a lot of Afghan households use these little tushaks that are kind of like mattresses that you put on the floor with pillows that surround them and on the walls. And that's usually a preference by the majority of Afghans. And you know, and some of them, you know, a lot of us transition once we move to the US of using tables and kind of changing that etiquette and mannerism. And one other notion is, you know, to ask thoughtful questions, just because we are a very big yes culture, and, you know, to save face and make you comfortable, we will always say yes. And, you know, one of these, the big experience that I had that I can personally recall was when I first moved to the States. A lot of people would be like, this is your first time seeing snow? Are you excited? Like, you guys don't have snow, right? And I would always be like, yes. They're like, no, we don't have snow. And then I was like, maybe that doesn't help them, you know more about our culture. And so this is kind of another big important point, to use Afghan, not Afghanistani yen, and not Afghani. Afghani is equivalent to the American dollar. Like, you wouldn't go to someone and be like, hey, this is my dollar friend. You know, it would just not sound right, because that's the currency. And so just like we have in Michigan, where you use the mitten to refer to different locations, we use what we call like the camel symbol. And so that's how you refer to different places in the country where you're from, and etc. Then another question that not only myself, but other Afghans that I have interacted with here in the West has been, when they say like, you're very Western, like you look very Western. And so before, asking something like that, these are some questions to think about. Maybe asking yourself like, what is Western? Is female empowerment Western? Is education Western? Is dressing up the way you want Western? Another point, with that is, I've noticed that, I guess from my personal interaction, is that you are a Muslim woman only if you wear a burqa or a hijab, but that's, really not true. I have Muslim friends that look just like you, that wear skirts and everything, but that doesn't mean that they don't practice Islam. And so for the next part, I will transition this over to Caitlin. All right, thank you, Fresha. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time here at the end to talk about the Afghan arrivals that are coming to West Michigan during this season. We've been having Afghans come for years now, but obviously this is a little bit of a unique situation. As a result of the United States military withdrawal from Afghanistan, the end of this summer, and the Taliban taking over the country, there has been a huge effort to evacuate many Afghans who were in danger because of this transition in power. Many of those Afghans were people that were somehow connected to our military or to an NGO or a part of another vulnerable group that would be particularly in danger because of the Taliban power. So, as I'm sure you saw in the news, all of those people were evacuated to the United States, and most of which have been on military bases throughout the US in order to be screened and processed. So just like all of our other refugee populations, these Afghans have been coming to the US only after having completed a very thorough screening and vetting security process that takes place through our different security branches of our government. So the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies are doing these checks to make sure that everyone who's entering into the country is safe. They also are going through a health screening process to make sure that there are not any public health risks. And then they're also undergoing immunizations and things like that before they are coming to West Michigan. Because everything happened so quickly, there were some unique circumstances that took place in order to provide immigration pathways for these Afghans that are arriving to the US. So there are kind of different statuses that I want to briefly go over because they kind of change the services that will be provided. So one that you might be familiar with from the past is called a special immigrant visa, or SIV. And those are people from Afghanistan who supported our military while we were there. So they, in exchange for their help in country, were offered a special pathway to come to the United States and become citizens. So those are special immigrant visas. Unfortunately, a lot of people were still in the process of getting that visa when Afghanistan came under the control of the Taliban. So there wasn't time to finish those applications, but people still needed to get over here. So the majority of people who are coming under what is called humanitarian parole. That word parole has nothing to do with what we would associate with parole, but it's just the legal term that they're given. So that is what most of the Afghans arriving to West Michigan now will have, is that humanitarian parole designation. It's similar in a lot of ways to asylum, in that that parole status gives them the ability to be here in the United States while we work out their legal status through an asylum application process. the logistics of that are still being worked out, but that's essentially what that looks like. And then the other status is just traditional refugee. So there continue to be Afghans who will need to be fleeing the country, and those people will end up going to refugee camps and processed and then come to the United States as a refugee, like you might be familiar with from other populations, such as the Congolese. So the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program is the program that the Department of State created in order to provide services for the humanitarian parolees. So this program is a 90-day program, similar to the traditional resettlement program that Bethany and Samaritas have been operating. And it kind of goes through the same service provisions that you would, you might think of, such as connecting to healthcare, supporting people in applying for Michigan IDs, bank accounts, DHHS benefits, school enrollment, housing, cultural orientation. All of those different things are things that the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program will support in. So that program is meant to serve these Afghan arrivals. I do want to note that the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program, or APA program, is not able to serve special immigrant visas, or SIVs, or traditional refugees. So it's specifically for humanitarian parolees. Those other statuses can be served through our traditional resettlement programs. There was a lot of talk at the beginning of this conversation back in late August, early September, that humanitarian parolees would not have access to the traditional resettlement benefits that we're used to refugees having. So there wasn't going to be access to Medicaid or food assistance or other Office of Refugee Resettlement programs, such as the Healing Center you might be familiar with, or Preferred Communities, our medical case management program. Fortunately, the government, the Congress passed the Extending Government Funding and Delivering Emergency Assistance Act back in September, which does allow for humanitarian parolees to be eligible for the same services as refugees. So they are now eligible for Medicaid, food assistance through the state of Michigan, as well as cash assistance. They are also now eligible for ORR programs, such as the Preferred Communities Program, Healing Center, all of those programs. So we're super excited that they are now eligible for all of those services. Looking forward to being able to connect them to those services at this time. I also want to specifically note that Bethany has agreed to resettle 230 Afghans to West Michigan over the coming weeks. We are planning to utilize the entire lakeshore, so have around 75 to 100 in Grand Rapids, and then also place people in Ottawa and Muskegon counties based on the support that we're able to find for housing and other volunteers. So that is kind of the approach that Bethany is taking right now. Samaritas has a similar approach as well. We know that you probably have a lot of questions, and we would love to answer those. So please submit your questions to the administrator of the presentation that you're watching, and they can get those questions to us. I know Freshta is really eager and excited to share her insight with you all so that you can competently and effectively welcome these Afghans. And I also am very open to answering any of your questions about eligibility requirements or the specific APA program that Bethany is implementing. All right, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. We appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for watching the presentation. I am going to make sure to pass along the questions that were shared here. And someone posed a question, and I see Jennifer, so I'm going to throw this out there. And Jennifer, if you want to speak to it, you're welcome to, but also don't want to put you on the spot. any advice or cultural considerations when encouraging mental health support or treatment for an individual or their family? And I think this is such a great question, and it's actually something that my organization and other individuals in the community have been really contemplating and working through, because the reality is I think there's a stigma around mental health for any community group. And so then figuring out how we address that stigma in each individual community group, there are going to be some similarities and some differences. There's also addressing a stigma of mental health, but then you also simultaneously need to address the barriers that prevent an individual from accessing and getting support with their mental health. So those can look very similar, and they can also be two very entirely different components and ways of moving. So I think, what I'm going to say is the most basic thing is what I believe to be true in any community group is making space for the conversation. And I think sometimes we dive into mental health when really the precursor, I think considering like what's the precursor that comes, maybe before like addressing if someone has a mental illness or a struggle, right? For me, it's always what comes before the burnout or the trauma or the stress or the mental illness. And often that's, how are we connecting with ourselves? How are we connecting with our community? How are we connecting with those? Where are we finding a sense of safety and love and connection? And I think that's important no matter what. But I have a few fabulous people here, so I'm going to offer to them to speak to this. Jessica or Jennifer, do either one of you have anything you want to add to the question of encouraging mental health support and treatment for an individual or their family?
Do you have anything to say, Jessica?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about just the way I think about it, but I didn't know if you had anything specific to Afghan culture that we should address first.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to keep it short because my client's here. But I think Sarah Jane really explained it well. It's taking the culture you're sitting in front of, and Freshta did a great job of educating us on that culture, and then keeping that as the worldview or the lens that you're looking at, and meeting them where they're at instead of forcing them to come into our whatever space we're in. So many times I will read body language, are they looking me in the eye? Are they not? I did not have some time to sit through something like what Freshta gave us. And so I had to go by, is this gentleman looking me in the eye and I'm a female? So how is he coming across in his culture? How is this female male interaction going to be? And just creating, like you said, Sarah Jane, that space in a very practical way. Once you're past that space, explaining mental health, there is a stigma. So many times I start with the facts of, if your body is hurting, you go to a doctor. And how did you learn to trust a doctor? How do you know a doctor is going to help you? And then getting them ready for that space of switching over to mental health. Are your thoughts bothering you? If your arm's in pain, you go to the doctor. If your thoughts don't shut off, where do you go? And just asking them those questions. If you're having nightmares, how would you fix those nightmares? Or would you want them to be fixed? And just getting their perspective on, they'll tell you, sometimes it'll lead into their religion, how they work. Sometimes it leads into how they perceive themselves spiritually, physically, and then you can work much better with that space and taking them in for mental health. And at the end of the day, you get to a point where they say, well, you're the mind doctor, you tell me. And you're like, no, I can't. I'm not that kind of doctor. But yeah, just providing that space and reading the room.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, I think exactly both of those, what each of them said. I might plan on taking a little more time to build that rapport, to help people become more comfortable. Having a very open, curious attitude towards where they're coming from and asking some of those questions, I think is absolutely fine. So taking time to figure things out in the room with the person, leaving that extra space, I think could be very helpful. For me personally, I've noticed that my original training came from this place of never tell a client anything about yourself ever. And when I started working with refugees, I had to make a shift towards they need to know something about you to feel safe with you. So it's a different set of interpersonal boundaries for me. Just figuring out what is appropriate to share and what's not. So most of my clients might know that I have a partner and cats, but they don't know if I'm having a bad day. So some of that basic information is really helpful for them to feel like they can talk to you. So yeah, and if you have any questions around that, feel it out with your co-therapist, your supervisor, ask us. We're all here to help. So yeah, those are some things I would think about.
Thank you. I think I just want to say, like, it can shift a little bit depending on the hat you're wearing, right? Like if you're speaking to it from the standpoint of a friend who has created a welcoming, hospitable environment and is in relationship versus a therapeutic relationship. So I appreciate, Jessica, that you gave that insight, right, of how you do have perhaps not no boundaries or absence of boundaries, but that your boundaries regarding interpersonal relationships look a little differently when you're trying to connect with an individual who is from a different culture community. So a great question. I am just going to quickly throw this up here and share with you all just a reminder again that this will continue same time, same place next week, which begins the series over again. So our first Wednesday will be Refugee 101, facilitated by Jessica. And then we, of course, have the repeat of the following. And our intention is to keep going through December and then kind of reevaluating and seeing where we go from there. So always in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments or middle of the night thoughts that you just need to throw out, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, we greatly appreciate you being here, giving your time and energy today, and just entering into a space that helps us be better understanders and I guess community members. Ultimately, it's community members, right? For these new members who are joining our community and creating a greater sense of welcome and acceptance for them as they enter into this space with us in the lovely West Michigan season. I'm having some feelings about the weather today. So anyways, on that note, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you all again later. Take care.